It all began when I was just 9 years old. My mom, Maria, married Harvey Henderson. At the time, I didn't think much of it. I was living with my dad in another state, and Harvey was just this guy my mom had decided to spend her life with. My dad was my everything. He made me laugh, was always there when I needed him, and gave me a sense of safety like no one else could. But everything changed when I turned 12. That was the year my dad passed away, and my life took a turn I never could have imagined. After the funeral, I moved in with my mom and Harvey. They lived in a small, quiet town, and it felt like I'd been dropped into a life that wasn't mine. I was grieving, lost, and filled with anger toward everything around me. My mom was always busy, working long hours, and we barely had a relationship. She was present in the house, but absent emotionally, leaving me to navigate my pain alone. I began acting out, sneaking out late at night, hanging with the wrong crowd, and making choices I regretted. My mom didn't seem to notice, or maybe she didn't know how to handle me. Harvey, however, noticed everything. He'd ask if I was okay, slip me money when I needed it, or surprise me with little gifts like jewelry or a new phone, saying I deserved nice things. At first I thought he was just being thoughtful, but looking back I realized it was something else entirely. I wish I could go back and change it all, but I can't. And now I'm trapped in the mess my life has become. It's hard to explain how much I miss my dad. He wasn't perfect, but he was my anchor, making everything feel okay, even when it wasn't. I remember the small things, how he'd wake me up early on Saturdays to make pancakes and let me flip them, even though I always messed up, or how he'd read the same bedtime story over and over, because I refused to pick a new one. Back then, those moments felt ordinary, but now they mean everything. When he died, it felt like the ground disappeared beneath me. One day I had a dad who hugged me, told me he loved me, and promised we'd go to the amusement park that summer. The next he was gone. The funeral is a blur. All I remember is the numbness sitting in my room, staring at the wall, and wishing it was just a bad dream. Then came the move to that suffocating small town to live with my mom and Harvey. Everything felt off. The house didn't feel like home. My mom was practically a stranger, and I felt completely unmoored. In those first months, I'd stay up late scrolling through old photos of my dad, crying until my eyes burned. My mom never came to check on me. She left early for work, came back late, and I was left to fend for myself. That's when I started spiraling. Staying out late became my escape. I couldn't sit in that house, drowning in memories of my dad. The people I hung out with didn't care about my sadness or anger. They just wanted to have fun. Fun meant drinking, partying, and making bad decisions. It felt like a way to numb the pain, even if just for a while. I skipped school too. What was the point? My mom didn't notice. She was always working, and though I know now she was doing it for us, back then, it just felt like she didn't care. Harvey was different. At first he seemed kind. He'd ask how my day was and tell me not to be too hard on myself. When I got caught skipping school, he didn't yell. He asked if something was wrong. He didn't press for answers, just said he was there if I needed to talk. Little by little, He started doing things that seemed sweet, buying me things I liked, leaving me notes with words of encouragement, or helping with dinner when my mom worked late. For a while, I thought he was just being a good stepdad. I needed someone to care, and he seemed to step into that role. Looking back, I see it differently. It wasn't just kindness, it was calculated. He found ways to make me trust him, to make me rely on him. I didn't see it then, I just thought someone finally noticed me. It felt like he was filling the void my dad had left, the one my mom didn't try to fill. For a while, I let him. I didn't realize what was happening. At first, I told myself Harvey was just being nice, stepping in where my mom couldn't. But over time, things began to feel different. It wasn't anything big, just small moments of compliment here, a touch there that felt harmless but also strange. I'll never forget the first time it felt off. I was in the kitchen making a sandwich when he walked in, smiled, and said, "You're growing up so beautifully, Leslie. You know that, right?" I froze. No one had ever said anything like that to me. I didn't know how to respond, so I just laughed awkwardly while he stood there watching me. It wasn't just the words, it was the way he said them. It wasn't just the words, it was the way he said them. Something about it made my stomach twist, but I shrugged it off. Then there were the hugs. At first, they didn't seem like a big deal. It's normal for a stepdad to hug his stepdaughter, right? But these hugs felt different. They lingered a little too long, and his hands would rest on my back, sometimes sliding just a bit lower than they should have. I told myself I was imagining it, that he didn't mean anything by it, but deep down it made me uneasy. There were other moments too, like when he'd brush the hair out of my face. It sounds small, almost insignificant, but it didn't feel that way. His hand would linger on my cheek, and he'd look at me in a way that made me want to pull back. But I didn't. I didn't know how. I didn't want to overreact or accuse him of something I wasn't sure about. Harvey also had a way of making me feel special. He'd listen when I talked about school or the things I liked, laughing at my jokes even when they weren't funny. Then there were the gifts. It started small little things like a notebook for school or my favorite snacks. But then it escalated. He bought me a gold necklace with a tiny heart pendant, saying it was just because I deserved something nice. Not long after, he surprised me with a new phone. My old one was cracked and barely functional. I'd been asking my mom for months to replace it, but she always said we couldn't afford it. One day, Harvey handed me a box with the latest model inside, sleek and brand new. "You need something reliable," he said, "so you can call me if you ever need anything." I didn't know what to feel. On one hand, I was thrilled none of my friends had a phone like this. On the other hand, it felt strange. Why would he spend so much on me? I hadn't even asked for it. My mom didn't find out until later. When she did, she just said, "Well, that was generous of him," and went back to what she was doing. I started to rely on Harvey. When my mom was too busy to notice me, he always did. He made me feel seen. I began telling him things I wouldn't tell anyone else, how much I missed my dad, or how I felt like I didn't fit in anywhere. He'd listen and say things like, "You're stronger than you think," or "I'll always be here for you, Leslie." It felt good to hear that, to have someone who seemed to care. but even then there was a nagging feeling I couldn't ignore. Every time he touched my shoulder or gave me one of those lingering hugs, my stomach would knot. I'd wonder, is this normal? Am I overthinking it? But I stayed silent. I didn't want to lose the one connection I thought I had. That's what made it so confusing. I craved his attention, yet it made me uneasy. It felt like walking a tightrope, not knowing whether to lean into his kindness or pull away from the discomfort it caused. The more I thought about it, the more trapped I felt. He was the only person who seemed to care about me, but the way he cared didn't always feel right. It all came to a head one night I'll never forget, no matter how much I want to. Maria had taken an extra shift at work, so it was just me and Harvey at home. He asked if I needed help with my math homework. It wasn't unusual, he'd been helping me with school for months, so I said yes. We sat at the dining table, papers spread out, calculators and pencils in hand. I struggled with a problem, and he leaned in close. So close I could feel his breath on my cheek. "You're really smart, Leslie," he said, his voice low. "You just don't give yourself enough credit." He placed his hand on mine, supposedly to guide me through the equation, but his touch lingered. His thumb softly brushed my skin. I froze, unsure of what to do or say. He looked at me, his eyes locking with mine. "You're so special," he whispered. Before I could react, he leaned in and kissed me. It wasn't quick or fatherly, it was something entirely different. My mind raced. I wanted to pull away, to scream, to demand what he thought he was doing, but I couldn't. I just sat there stunned. When he finally pulled back, he said, "I love you, Leslie. You know that, right? This is our secret." His words felt heavy, suffocating. I didn't know how to respond. He told me I made him feel alive, that I was the one thing in his life that truly made him happy. He said it like it was a compliment, like I should feel proud. But all I felt was sick. After that night, everything changed. Harvey began finding more reasons to be alone with me, offering to drive me places or ensuring we were alone when my mom was at work. Each time he'd remind me that this was about love, that what we had was special. He promised to wait for me, saying that once I turned 18, we could be together officially. It was twisted, but I didn't have the words to explain how I felt. I hated it. I hated myself for the small part of me that felt validated. After so long of feeling invisible, unloved, and unworthy, Harvey made me feel seen. But it came at a cost. Every time it happened, I'd lie awake at night, replaying the moments in my head, telling myself, "Here's the rephrased version with the same length and tone." It wasn't my fault. I didn't ask for any of this. But then I'd think about how I never stopped it either. That guilt ate away at me. Then came the filming. The first time, he said it was something special, just for us, a private way to capture how much we cared about each other. I didn't want to, but he had this way of making me feel like saying no wasn't an option. "It's just for us, Leslie," he said. "No one will ever see it. It's our little piece of forever." I hated every moment of it, but I couldn't bring myself to stop him. The videos became his way of keeping control. Any time I hesitated or tried to pull away, he'd remind me they existed. "You wouldn't want anyone to see these, would you?" He'd say with a half smile that felt more like a threat than a joke. It was his way of ensuring I couldn't leave, couldn't tell anyone. I started feeling like I was drowning. I couldn't talk to my mom, she'd never believe me. Even if she did, what could she do? Harvey had perfected the image of a loving husband and stepdad. No one would ever suspect him. I couldn't tell my friends either. What would I even say? That my stepdad claimed to love me and I was too weak to stop him. The worst part was the isolation. The more time I spent with Harvey, the more he pulled me away from everyone else. He made me believe no one else would understand, that no one could care about me like he did, and I started to believe him. I'd fallen so deeply into his control that I didn't know how to escape. Even now I can hear his words echoing in my mind. This is love, Leslie. No one will ever love you like I do. It was a lie, but it was one I lived for far too long. The weight of it crushed me. It happened one evening when Maria was working late again. I was in my room, scrolling aimlessly through my phone, trying to distract myself from my thoughts. Harvey knocked softly on my door before stepping in. "Hey," he said in a calm, reassuring voice. "You've been in here all day? Want to come watch a movie? It might cheer you up." I hesitated. Part of me wanted to say no, to stay alone, but guilt crept in. He was always so kind, or at least that's what I told myself then. So I agreed. In the living room, he had already set up the couch with blankets and snacks. It looked harmless, like he was just trying to be thoughtful. We started watching an old movie I barely paid attention to. My eyes stayed on the screen, but my mind wandered. Harvey sat a little too close, though I tried to ignore it. About halfway through, he draped a blanket over both of us and put his arm around my shoulders. I froze for a moment, but convinced myself it wasn't a big deal. I even leaned into him slightly, telling myself this must be what having a normal family felt like. Then he started stroking my hair, his fingers brushing gently. "You're so beautiful, Leslie," he said softly, his voice barely a whisper. My stomach flipped. I didn't know how to respond, so I said nothing. He tilted my face toward him, his hand resting lightly on my cheek. "You know how much I care about you, right?" he asked, his eyes searching mine. I nodded, feeling trapped under his gaze. Before I could process what was happening, he kissed me. It wasn't a quick fatherly kiss on the cheek. It was something entirely different. I pulled back slightly, but he kept his hands on my face, holding me gently. "It's okay," he said. "You don't have to be scared. I'd never hurt you." My heart pounded as I froze, unsure of what to do. He kissed me again. This time I didn't pull away, but I didn't lean in either. I just sat there paralyzed. He kept whispering to me, telling me how special I was, how much I meant to him. His hands moved cautiously, testing my boundaries. I wanted to tell him to stop, but the words wouldn't come. Part of me was terrified, but another part felt like maybe I owed him. He'd been so kind, so patient, always listening when no one else did. He'd help me when I felt like no one cared. I told myself this was what love looked like, even though deep down I knew it wasn't. Things escalated quickly after that. He kept reassuring me, saying, "This is just between us. It's our secret." He made it sound sacred, like something special, and I let it happen. I don't know why I didn't scream or push him away. Maybe I was afraid of what he'd do, or maybe I just didn't know how to handle it. When it was over, I felt numb. I sat on the couch, pulling the blanket tightly around me, staring at the TV as if nothing had happened. Harvey sat beside me, his arm draped casually over the couch, acting like everything was normal. "You're amazing, Leslie," he said, smiling. "I'm so lucky to have you." I couldn't respond. I felt like I'd crossed a line I could never uncross. At the same time, I felt trapped. He'd been the only person who made me feel like I mattered, and now I didn't know how to look at him or myself the same way. Not long after that night on the couch, things took another turn, one I didn't see coming. Harvey found more and more excuses to be alone with me. He'd come into my room under the guise of checking on me, or offer to take me out for drives while Maria was at work. Each time he'd remind me how much he cared, how much he loved me, and each time I felt more and more suffocated, unable to escape. Maria was working another long shift, and Harvey suggested we hang out in his office. "It's quieter in there," he said with a casual smile, as if it were the most normal thing in the world. I followed him, still unsure why I kept agreeing to everything he suggested. He shut the door behind us and started sorting through some papers on his desk. Then he pulled a small handheld camera from a drawer. "I want to capture how special you are," he said softly, his expression kind and reassuring, the same one he always used to make me feel safe. I froze, staring at the camera in his hands. My instincts screamed at me to leave, but I couldn't move. "It's just for us," he added, stepping closer. "I want something to remember these moments by. You trust me, don't you?" That word, trust, hit me hard. I'd spent months convincing myself that he cared about me, that I owed him for the attention and kindness he'd shown me. So I nodded. I told myself it was fine, that it wasn't a big deal. At first it was just pictures. Simple ones of me sitting on the couch or lying on my bed, awkwardly smiling at the lens. But then he'd ask me to just tilt my head, move my hair, or fix my shirt. "You're so beautiful," he'd say in that low, steady voice. "I just want to capture you exactly as you are." I hated the way it made me feel, but I couldn't find the words to say no. The first time he asked to film, I hesitated. He noticed and sat beside me, placing his hand gently on my knee. "It's okay, Leslie," he said in his soothing tone. "No one will ever see this. It's just for us, something to look back on when it's just the two of us." He kept talking, telling me how much he loved me, how much he trusted me. His words broke down my resistance, and I let him press record. I felt a knot in my stomach as I sat there, barely moving, barely breathing. He spoke softly behind the camera, telling me how perfect I was, how much I meant to him. At first, he just filmed me sitting there, but then he asked me to move, to pose. "Just a little to the left," he'd say. "Tilt your chin up." Perfect. It didn't stop there. The filming escalated, becoming more intimate. "This is just for us," he'd remind me, convincing me it was something special, something sacred. Each time I wanted to say no, but the words wouldn't come. I told myself it wasn't as bad as it felt, that maybe it was normal. but it never felt normal. It felt wrong, suffocating. The camera became his weapon. It wasn't just a tool anymore, it was a way to control me. He'd set it up unexpectedly, even when I wasn't prepared. Once, I told him I didn't want to do it anymore. His demeanor changed, but he didn't yell. Instead, he leaned in close and said, "Leslie, you don't want anyone to see what we've already done, do you? These are private just for us. But if someone else saw them," the unspoken threat hung in the air, heavy and terrifying. That's when it hit me I wasn't just stuck. He had the power to destroy me. We lived in a small town, and I knew what would happen if those videos got out. The shame, the whispers, the stares, I couldn't handle it. So I nodded and kept going along with it, even though every time the red light on the camera blinked, I felt like I was losing another piece of myself. It didn't happen all at once. The control crept in slowly, like a fog I couldn't escape. At first, I thought I could manage it, that I could separate what he was doing from how I felt. But the weight of it began to crush me. I stopped answering texts from friends. They'd invite me to hang out, and I'd always make excuses. I'm busy, I'm tired, or maybe another time. Eventually, they stopped asking. School became unbearable. I'd sit in class, staring at the clock, counting the minutes until I could leave. But I didn't want to go home either. Being around Harvey made my skin crawl, but the alternative, being out in public, where people might ask questions, felt just as bad. I started skipping school altogether, wandering aimlessly through town or hiding in the library where no one would bother me. I couldn't focus on homework or muster the energy to care about grades or tests. Then came the nightmares. I'd wake up in the middle of the night, shaking and drenched in sweat, haunted by images of Harvey's face or the blinking red light of the camera. His voice echoed in my mind, "This is just for us." I started dreading sleep, but being awake wasn't any better. The exhaustion pulled me deeper into a hole I didn't know how to climb out of. I thought about ending it, telling Harvey I couldn't do it anymore. But every time I tried, his voice replayed in my head, "You don't want anyone to see these, do you?" He didn't need to raise his voice or threaten me outright. The calm, calculated tone was enough to keep me silent. The mere thought of those videos being exposed was paralyzing. I imagined the entire town knowing. The whispers, the stares, the humiliation. And so I stayed quiet. I did what he wanted, even as it suffocated me. Every time I saw that camera, I felt more of myself slipping away, like I was disappearing piece by piece. I felt like a ghost of who I used to be, trapped in a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. Laughing, my teachers staring at me with pity, I imagined my mother discovering not just the videos, but everything. The shame was unbearable. The first time I tried to pull away, I told Harvey I needed space, explaining that I was stressed about school and just needed time for myself. He smiled, a look that seemed to see right through me. "You know I'll always be here for you," he said smoothly, his tone calm and reassuring. Then he leaned closer and added, "But remember, Leslie, we have to protect each other. If anyone finds out about us, well, it wouldn't just be me they'd blame." His words hit me like a slap. It wasn't just a threat, it was a twisted way of making me feel equally at fault, as though my life would fall apart if I spoke up. After that, I stopped trying. I felt like I was suffocating but couldn't see a way out. Every time he touched me or whispered those sweet, sickening words, I felt like I was sinking further into a pit I couldn't climb out of. I started blaming myself. Maybe I'd somehow led him on. Maybe it was my fault for not stopping him sooner. I replayed every moment in my mind, trying to pinpoint where I went wrong, but the guilt never went away. The worst part was how it changed how I saw my mom. Every time I looked at her, guilt would overwhelm me. She didn't deserve this. She didn't deserve me. She was working so hard, trying to hold everything together, and I was betraying her in the worst way. I wanted to tell her, but every time I tried to imagine the words, I froze. What could I say? That the man she trusted, the man she loved, wasn't who she thought he was. That I'd let it go on for years without telling her. The fear of her reaction of what she might say or do kept me silent. I began to believe no one would ever understand. Who could I tell? My friends, they probably think I was lying or worse, that I wanted it. A teacher. They'd call the police, and then the entire town would know. I'd become the girl who ruined her family, the girl who couldn't keep her stepdad away. Even if someone believed me, what could they do? Harvey had the videos. He had the power and I had nothing. Every day felt heavier than the last. I spent hours in my room, staring at the walls, wishing I could disappear. I stopped eating, stopped caring about anything. My mom started noticing. She'd ask if I was okay, but her questions felt half-hearted, like she was asking out of obligation. "I'm fine," I'd say, forcing a smile. She'd nod and go back to whatever she was doing, leaving me to carry the weight of my lie. There were moments I thought about running away, packing a bag, and leaving in the middle of the night. But where would I go? And even if I left, what would stop Harvey from releasing the videos out of spite? No matter what I did, he'd find a way to ruin me. I felt trapped, like I was living someone else's nightmare. And the worst part was, I wasn't sure I'd ever wake up. It all became too much. I couldn't keep pretending everything was fine while I was falling apart inside. My grades slipped, my friends were gone, and my mom, Maria, started noticing. At first, it was just small comments. "You've been so quiet lately," or "Is everything okay at school?" I'd brush her off with a quick, "I'm fine," but I could see the worry in her eyes. One night, I caught her standing in my doorway, watching me like she wanted to say something but didn't know how. I was sitting at my desk, pretending to study, staring blankly at an open notebook. "You know you can talk to me, right?" she said softly, her voice hesitant. I wanted to tell her everything right then, but the words stuck in my throat. How could I tell her that the man she trusted wasn't who she thought he was? Instead, I nodded and muttered, "I know." She stood there a moment longer before walking away, and the guilt crushed me all over again. She didn't deserve this. She didn't deserve to have her life shattered, but I didn't know what else to do. Then came the breaking point. Harvey had grown more aggressive with his threats. One day, after I told him I didn't want to be alone with him anymore, he pulled out his phone and scrolled through the videos. "You sure about that, Leslie?" he asked coldly. "You wouldn't want anyone to see these, would you?" That was the moment I realized I couldn't keep this a secret any longer. I had to find a way out no matter how terrified I was. I started thinking about how to tell my mom, but every time I pictured her face hurt, angry, betrayed, I froze. What if she didn't believe me? What if she blamed me? What if Harvey convinced her I was lying? The doubt paralyzed me. One night, I decided to write her a letter. It felt like the only way to get everything out without breaking down. I poured my heart onto the page, explaining how it started, how trapped I felt, and how I didn't know how to ask for her help. I left the letter on the kitchen counter before going to bed, my hands trembling the whole time. But when I woke up the next morning, the letter was gone, and Maria didn't say a word. My heart sank. Did she read it? Did Harvey find it first? The uncertainty was unbearable. I spent the entire day on edge, waiting for anything to happen, but everything stayed eerily normal. That night, I realized I couldn't wait any longer. I had to make her see. So I did something I never thought I'd do. I sent her an email. I attached screenshots of Harvey's texts and photos of the gifts he'd given me, hoping it would be enough to convince her. I hit send and sat there, staring at the screen, feeling like my heart might explode. Now I'm sharing this story because I don't know what will happen next. I need your help. If you've ever been in a situation like mine or know someone who has, please tell me what you did. How did you find a way out? How did you make people believe you? I feel so alone, but I know I'm not the only one. There have to be others who felt this way. If you're watching this and feel as lost as I do, maybe we can figure it out together. Maybe sharing my story will help someone else find the strength to speak up, or help me find the strength to keep going. I don't know what will happen when my mom reads that email, but I know I can't keep living like this. If this story resonates with you, please share it. Someone out there might need to hear it as much as I needed to say it. And if you have advice, anything, I'm begging you to leave a comment. It feels like there's no way out, but maybe together we can find one.